let's start because we appreciate very much everyone is on time, and thank you for joining us. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on your specific time zone. We are all over the globe, almost. The Tzvi School of Historical Studies, together with the Divinity Foundation, is very happy to welcome everyone to this special seminar with Professor David נירנברג of the University of Chicago. These are not easy times. This is certainly a sentence which we have said too many times in the past 2 years, and we need to say it again now. It seems that we are washed again under a new COVID-19 wave, and we must take care of our bodies, but we must also take care of the mind and spirit. And a seminar with Professor נירנברג is certainly a great intellectual remedy. Professor נירנברg's CV is too long and distinguished to be easily summarized here, and everyone who came to this seminar probably knows and respects our guest anyway. While there is no need perhaps to introduce him, there is every need to say thank you to the current dean of the Divinity School at the University of Chicago, the incoming director of the Institute of Advanced Studies in Princeton, and a leading historian of interfaith relations and medieval and early modern history for taking the time and speaking with us today. So David, thank you again, and the floor or the Zoom screen is all yours.
Thank you, Miriam. Thank you. I also want to thank Tamara and Ariel and the Divinity Foundation for suggesting this in the first place, and really all of you for being here in these pandemic zoomed out times. I'm going to share a screen, and then I'm going to give. I'd like to share with you some thinking about the Western Mediterranean that is part of the project that I spoke about for the Dan David event. So some of you may have heard the broader kind of global framing of this. I will probably repeat at the very beginning and at the very end some of that material, but I hope not too much. And this is very much work in progress. So I'd be very grateful for your criticism, suggestions, advice. It's also a new computer, so when I share a screen, I don't know if it will work, but we're going to try. Open system.
I communicate with you, and you can hear us, so we will be able to actually pass on information from one side of the.
Yeah, well, it wants me to. Let's see if this will work. And if it doesn't work, then we will just, got it? All right. Every time you switch computers, terrible things happen, but we all know that. So I'd like to offer something of an overview of this project, which I am struggling with. And I think I've already mentioned what it is. It's a world history of the range of discriminations we call racism, and the role of religion in shaping those discriminations. And I do emphasize in this world history, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They're at the center of the history, but they're not the first two and not the last two chapters. And today I really want to talk about one of the key chapters, the one closest to my own research, the one I used to think I knew something about. I call the project overwhelming. It's not just because it's of its geographic and chronological scale, but also because both race and religion are, I don't need to tell you, hotly contested concepts. When it comes, and here I'm going to repeat a tiny bit at the Dan David lecture, when it comes to race, many deny that it is much of a history at all. And I think of the anthropologist Ashley Montague, whose 1942 book, Man's Most Dangerous Myth, The Fallacy of Race, drew on the timely example of the Jews to argue that race is purely modern because it depends on a purely modern biology. Now, many professional historians today agree that we should speak of race only in modernity. This is less true of the youngest generation. They give different reasons for this restriction. Some put the stress, as Montague did, on the absence of biological knowledge, of some kind of biological knowledge before some particular point in the modern history of science. Others follow Michel Foucault in emphasizing what they take to be distinctively modern and Western European forms of biopolitics. Still others point to the European colonization of the Americas and the transatlantic slave trade that followed as the origins of race and racism. And that's a very strong tendency in North America, obviously. And still others, fewer, point to the modernity of the word race itself. And I'm sure there are other arguments too. Now, to my mind, none of these arguments should prevent us from inquiring into the long history of race. Consider one distinguished historian's argument against speaking of race in the Middle Ages. I won't read you the slides because I know you can read them very well. But if this defense here, Bartlett's defense, were adequate, we couldn't speak of race or racism in any period at all. Critical race theory has taught us many things, but one thing it has certainly taught us, it is that there does not exist a truly biological modern racism. So we could just as well say, as opposed to Bartlett, that while the language of race in modern sources is biological, its modern reality is almost entirely cultural. In both the medieval and the modern cases, systems of discrimination are the product of cultural work, not of biological reality, as we always, we have to do that gesture when we talk about reality. Nor do I find arguments from vocabulary convincing. The history of concepts can't be reduced to our knowledge of nouns. Still, the history of race should give advocates of its modernity pause, for it was first applied to humans around 1400, when medieval Castilians borrowed the term raza from veterinary treatises about horses in order to designate the hereditary stigma that attached to descendants of converts from Judaism to Christianity. And roughly a century later, the word's meaning expanded to include the descendants of converts from Islam to Christianity, as you can see in this famous definition from 1611. So almost 20 years ago, I studied the question of raza in Christian Iberia and tried to suggest that pre-modern work of difference making can fruitfully be compared to modern concepts of race. But I also stressed that those comparisons shouldn't turn into genealogical histories of racism that assign blame to any one people, religion, or culture, or for its invention. And I think today these genealogical histories are becoming popular, particularly histories of race. So I want to ask again, how can we study biocultural discriminations from the distant past to gain a critical understanding of biocultural discriminations in the present? And I'm going to propose an approach that is of simultaneously constructive and destructive comparison. I'm going to offer historical sketches of two, I'm going to call them biocultural processes to avoid saying race all the time, triggered by episodes of mass conversion from one religion to another, one in Christian Spain and one in Islamic North Africa, and argue that each can fruitfully be understood as racializing. I'll present both sketches as plausible historical accounts of how a particular religious cultural generated concepts that lie within the semantic field we call race. And I'll argue that there's a great deal that is historically specific and important about the Western reaches of the Mediterranean, Spain and North Africa, Al-Andalus and Ifriqiya, if you like, as crucibles of race. But I'll treat neither, meaning as places where new racial ideas are formed. But I'll treat neither as an origin. In fact, by treating the sketches side by side, I hope to make clear why neither history on its own, nor really any other, can serve as a critical history of race unless it simultaneously recognizes its interconnectedness with other potential histories. And I won't repeat the word interconnectedness too many times, but I got it from Marshall Hodgson, and it's very much in my mind. And I do want to see all of history as interconnected in some way. So in order to demonstrate this, I will link both of these histories to ever deeper historical contexts until reaching, well, I'm going to do little of this. This is what I did in the Dan David lecture, until reaching the prehistory of the Neolithic. My goal is to convince you that context matters, we know that, and that writing long histories of race also matters, but that no matter how deep our context or how long our histories of race, we should never claim to be at the beginnings of race and racism. We're always already in the middle of something, and we need to look backward, forward, and sideways if we hope to avoid the danger of producing false genealogies of racism, which themselves risk becoming racist history. Now, Iberian history has long served as a focal point for arguments about pre-modern race because the peninsular kingdoms were among the most religiously and ethnically diverse in medieval Western Europe. By the end of the 13th century, the peninsula was largely ruled by Christian kings, but its kingdoms still retained large populations of Muslims and Jews. And I offer you this readable because it has a beautiful representation of both Jews and Muslims and Christians and the dangers posed by their proximity. Beginning in 1391, as everyone in this Zoom room knows, those lands underwent massive attempts to eliminate that religious diversity through massacre, segregation, conversion, inquisition, and expulsion. And those efforts were successful. Over the course of the 100 years that stretched from the massacre and forced conversion of Jews in 1391 to the expulsion of all Jews from the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon in 1492 and from Portugal in 1496, all the Jews of the peninsula were either converted or expelled. And the conversion and expulsion of the peninsula's Muslims followed. From the conquest of Granada in 1492, the forced conversions in the early 16th century, to the expulsion of the Moriscos, that is the descendants of those converts from Islam, in 1609. Okay, so the forced conversion of tens of thousands of Jews to Christianity in 1391 proved to be, again, we all know this story. The Spanish story, I think, is well known. It's the African story that's much less well known. So I'm going to start with the Spanish. But it proved to be a powerful catalyst of thought about the relationship between genealogy and religion. It produced an enormous debate about the relationship between fleshy lineages and spiritual attributes, as well as producing new institutions, such as the Inquisition, and new qualifications for power, such as purity of blood, all devised to discriminate between Christians descended from Jewish converts and those who were old Christians, clean Christians, Christians by nature. These new discriminations claim to be rooted in natural realities. According to the doctrine of limpieza de sangre, for example, Jewish and later Muslim blood was inferior to Christian. The possession of any amount of such blood was reproduced in the sperm and the egg and the milk, and was and made the offspring liable to heresy and moral corruption. Therefore, any descendants of Jews and later Muslims should be barred from church and secular office, from any number of guilds and professions, from emigrating to the Americas, and especially from marrying old Christians. It's in this context that the Romance word raza, race, migrated from veterinary manuals to the vocabulary of animal and human reproduction. In the world of animal breeding, it quickly came to mean something like pedigree, as here in a popular manual on equine care from around 1430. At more or less the same time, At more or less the same time, raza emerged in Castilian literature as a way of describing a variety of defects linked to Judaism. Alfonso Martínez de Toledo, writing around 1438, in the midst of a conflict over converso office holding, provides a clever example. I'm distracted by the image, I'm sorry. You'll see every day. His argument is that you could always tell a person's roots. For those who descend from good stock, he says, are incapable of deviating from it, whereas those of base stock cannot transcend their origins. Nature procures this, he says. And then he offers this example, which I leave for you to read. Notice how in these early applications of raza to the political fitness of descendants of converts from Judaism, the word is already saturated with reproductive knowledge, mostly taken from the world of animal breeding. By 1449, the logic was powerful enough to animate a racial civil war in Castile, centered on the city of Toledo, where Alfonso Martínez came from. The rebels claimed that the baptized Jews and those proceeding from their damaged line, and that's a quote, not my own language, were waging war against Christianity and seeking power in order to stain the clean blood of old Christians through intermarriage. Hence, they issued a law banning descendants of converts from holding public office for at least 4 generations. So that's the first of the Castilian statutes of purity of blood. Now, there's also text produced by the defenders of the conversos, on the other hand, and these constitute a corpus of powerful arguments against discriminations of faith amongst Christians on the basis of, I'll say race, raza, because they said race, raza. The defenders combed early Christian texts in order to claim that spiritual discriminations based on the reproduction of flesh were unchristian and heretical. At the same time, even the conversos defenders often or sometimes found themselves proposing their own biologics. Bishop Alonso de Cartagena is the most important of these defenders, and he produced the most important treatise, The Defense of the Unity of Christendom, in 1449. But at times, even he did not reject his opponent's theses about the biological reproduction of culture, as for example, in his rebuttal of the rebels' claim that Jewish blood transmits cowardice. True, he wrote, Jews today, in 1449, are debased and cowardly, but this is because they are enslaved in unbelief after the coming of Christ. The Old Testament chronicled the courage of the ancient Israelites, he says, and that courage would shine forth again once Jews were baptized. For, he says, courage is a virtue reproduced in the flesh. And he cites Aristotle and horse breeding in order to make his point. And again, I won't read you the quote. As we all know, the defenders of converts and their descendants lost the war. The idea that descent from Jewish and Muslim converts made Christians inescapably prone to heresy became a basic truth, legitimating massive and violent discriminations and informing many later debates about the reproductive biology of difference. I offer here an example from Juan Huarte de San Juan's famous physiological and psychological treatise, Examen de Ingenios para las Ciencias of 1575, a work then at the cutting edge of natural science and so influential that Lessing translated it into German 2 centuries later. And here, the cutting edge of science being displayed is the argument for the power of genetics over the power of climate, which in some ways we would agree with, right? And here he gives you an argument about the power of human seed. And he gives 2 examples. Just as Blacks in Spain pass on their color to their descendants by their seed without being in Ethiopia, similarly, the people of Israel, coming also to Spain, can communicate to its descendants its sharpness of intellect without being in Egypt or eating manna. So whatever their varying biologics, these ideas about the reproduction of Judaism would shape thinking about categories of difference, not only on the Iberian Peninsula, but also throughout the entire Spanish and Portuguese empires, which is to say, much of the world for the next 500 years. And I could regale you with examples from Goa in 1644, or from, this really is a world phenomenon, Iberian raza. So let's now cross the 7.7 miles of salt water that separate Europe from Africa at the Straits of Gibraltar and look for a moment at the Almohad movement, which imposed a distinctive vision of Islam across vast regions of Iberia and North Africa. Almohad derives from the Arabic al-Muwahhidun, those professing the unicity of God. Most importantly for our purposes, the Almohads also proposed that true Islam should no longer tolerate Judaism and Christianity in Islamic lands, and they imposed conversion or death on the Jews and Christians in the regions that came under their control. The events left a profound mark on the future of Jewish ideas about conversion, but it's the Muslim side that interests us for present purposes because the conversions seem to have catalyzed thinking about genealogy and the reproduction of religion in Western Islamic lands. The Almohad ruler Abu Yusuf al-Mansur and his successors imposed a number of discriminations upon descendants of these converts. Regulations compel the descendants to wear degrading attire, such as distinctive robes, or skull caps instead of turbans, or yellow turbans instead of other colored turbans, and distinguishing signs. Remember, this is before Fourth Lateran imposes the badge on Jews of Europe. So this is earlier than that. Regulations, according to the description of these discriminations in a near contemporary chronicle, the rulers were motivated by doubt about sincerity of the new Muslims' belief. And here's that chronicle account. The philosopher and exegete Joseph ben Judah ibn Aknin, himself probably a coerced convert to Islam, describes the discriminations brought to bear upon the descendants of converts in his Tib al-Nufus, the hygiene of the souls. Still unedited. It would be wonderful to have this. The more we obey their instructions and comply with their doctrines and forsake our own, the more they burden our yoke and increase our travail. The proof can be seen in the afflictions suffered by the apostates of our land. Even the conversion of their fathers or grandfathers a century ago has been of no advantage to them. And not even intermarriage could erase the stigma. That he says that the children of an old Muslim with a female Jewish captive or convert are despised, so spurned that even the meanest Muslim will not contract an alliance with them. With the benefit of more hindsight than he had, we could say that centuries would not suffice to purge these lineages of Jewishness. Muslims descended from converts from Judaism came to be known as muhajirun, emigres. The Arabic word had been used positively in the context of early Islam to describe those believers who emigrated from Mecca to Medina with the Prophet Muhammad. In the Maghreb, it came to mean the descendants of converts from Judaism to Islam. We could follow the history of discrimination against the emigres across North African dynasties all the way into the 20th century. That history produced a great debate, much like that going on in Christian Spain at the same time, between those who argued that the Islamic tradition justified and even required the stigmatization and segregation of these Jewish Muslim lineages, and those who argued that the tradition forbade any such discrimination among believers. Along the course of these polemics, insisting on one's family's distance from lineages of Jewish Muslims became a key strategy in struggles for power and privilege in North Africa. Consider, and I'll just give a couple of examples, the claims of the Shurafa, singular Sharif, that emerged in the 12th century. These were Arab lineages that claimed direct descent from the family of the Prophet Muhammad, and who argued that both political and prophetic power should be restricted to members of the Prophet's lineage. In North Africa, the privileges of the Shurafa were often articulated by arguing for the exclusion of the Muhajirun. Over time, the two groups, Shurafa and Muhajirun, descendants of Muhammad and descendants of Jews, came to stand in stark antithesis. On the one hand, the Shurafa, a blood aristocracy, as Mercedes Garcia put it, that carried with it the notion that some of the gifts of the Prophet and even prophecy itself were hereditary, and that's the end of Mercedes's quote. And on the other, an anti-prophetic lineage of Muslims descended from Jews, whose blood transmitted the disabilities heaped upon that people. Let me offer just one example of these disabilities, an economic one. For centuries, the Shurafa attempted to ban the Muhajirun from the great market of Fez, known as the Caesarea, on the grounds that the Muhajirun had inherited the deceitful business practices of the Jews, with the monarchy generally supporting the readmission of the Muhajirun after each ban. In 1437, the tomb of Mulai Idris II, who died in 828, great-great-great-great-grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, founder of the Islamic Maghreb and genealogical touchstone of the Shurafa, was, so to speak, discovered at the market site. We should see, or we could see, this discovery as itself a product of the conflict I'm describing, a strategy to seize control of the market by converting it into a shrine to the political, religious, and economic claims of the Shurafa, a miraculous condemnation, so to speak, of the Muhajirun. As in Spain, this debate was not one-sided. In 1641, the scholar Muhammad bin Ahmad Mayara collected 17 fatwas and several administrative decrees, all from the 16th century, all condemning the exclusion of Muslims of Jewish descent from the Fez market. He also penned his own critique of the discriminatory measures of his day. If you go back far enough, he asks, are not all Muslims descendants of converts? Which is exactly what Alonso de Cartagena asked also. Mayara challenges genealogies generally, pointing out that they and the claims based upon them are often invented. And he even suggests, and this was also suggested in Spain, that old Muslims attack new ones because they're covering up anxieties about their own lineage. He points out that many of the Shurafa of Fez are immigrants from Iberia, refugees from the collapse of Islamic Andalusia. Perhaps they boast in order to conceal that their own ancestors were converts from Christianity, he suggests. So as part of his defense, Mayara combs early Islamic traditions in which the Prophet forbade any discrimination against converts, and he stresses those in which Muhammad declares that it is only in piety that Muslims are superior to one another, for God cares more about good behavior than family ties. All of these strategies have analogs in the Christian Iberian tradition. And as was the case in Iberia, they weren't particularly successful. Discriminations continued. A century after Mayara, another learned inhabitant of Fez, Muhammad ibn Zikri, who died in 1731, wrote his Sip of Honey on the Eminence of the Israelites and Arabs against the exclusion of Muslims of Jewish descent from official scholarly positions and against the refusal of old Muslims to marry into new Muslim families. Remember, we're now 500 years after the conversions. Like Mayara, Ibn Zikri draws heavily on an egalitarian strand of early Islam that stresses the equality of all believers before God. But unlike Mayara, and like Alonso de Cartagena, he not only tries to destigmatize Jewish lineages, but also to ennoble them. Are not the Jews descended from prophets? Muslims of Jewish descent should therefore be honored, he says, rather than scorned. Thanks to an anonymous commentator on Ibn Zikri's treatise, we know that old Muslims in 18th century Morocco were outraged rather than convinced by his arguments. But though the argument that Israelite lineage ennobles the Muslims did not convince many, it wasn't new, and it could be attributed to the Prophet himself. Early traditions recount that after the Prophet conquered the Jewish fortifications of Khaybar in 629, he married Safiya, daughter of their king, who converted to Islam after her capture. One day, Muhammad found his new wife weeping. When he asked her why she wept, she replied, I heard Aisha and Hafsa jeering at me, saying, we are superior to Safiya, for not only are we the Prophet's wives, we are also his cousins. And Muhammad responded according to this tradition, which, by the way, is reported by Mayara and by Ibn Zikri. Why did you not reply to them saying, how can you be nobler than I, whose father is Aaron, whose uncle is Moses, and whose spouse is Muhammad? So this quick sketch may suffice to allow a conclusion. From the 12th century to the 20th, biocultural discourses about Jewish lineages did important work within the North African Islamic community. They provided it with powerful tools of inter-Muslim discrimination that we may, for certain purposes and questions, usefully understand as analogous to race and racism. So I've now offered two parallel histories of biocultural logics emerging from mass conversion in an area of the world where Catholic Christianity, Islam, and Judaism met and mingled with particular intensity. One of these histories is very well known. Who hasn't heard of the Spanish Inquisition? And the other is the domain of 2 or 3 specialists. What questions can the historian ask with this comparison in hand? A searcher after the origins of race might now be tempted to shift those origins from the forced conversion of Jews in Christian Spain to the earlier Almohad conversion of Jews to Islam that may have influenced the Spanish case. Another, interested in transatlantic futures, might grant that the histories of Islam and Christianity were intimately intertwined in the Western Mediterranean, but insist that only the biocultural fantasies minted in Christian Spain really matter, because it was the Spaniards who went on to colonize the New World. Still another, aware of the important role that Maghrebi centers of learning played in sub-Saharan West Africa, might ask how North African ideas about conversion and lineage contributed to the willingness of Muslims to sell other Muslims into transatlantic slavery. We have lots of treatises generated in sub-Saharan and in the Maghreb about that question. Yet another might focus on the comparison itself. What was shared and what was different in the intertwined histories of North Africa and Iberia that catalyzed these mappings of lineage onto faith? And then from the comparison, we can deduce key social, political, theological, or intellectual variables in the catalysis of racism. I think as historians, we're free to choose between these and many other instructive paths, each of which may be useful for a particular purpose in history. We should recognize, however, that every path is partial and provincial, nor should we imagine that anyone will discover the origins of race or racism in late 14th century Christian Spain or in the 13th century Almohad Empire. After all, the biocultural imagination of these societies was not invented with the appearance of conversos or muhajirun. The argument about purity of blood in 15th and 16th century Toledo, for example, frequently invoked the actions of the 7th century Visigothic kings and bishops of the peninsula. King Sisebut had ordered his Jewish subjects baptized by force around 615, and in the years following, his bishops and successors codified legislation, placing those converts and their descendants under ongoing disabilities. The 7th century canons regarding converted Jews in Visigothic kingdoms made their way into Gratian's Decretum in the 12th century, becoming law about neophytes for the Universal Catholic Church. So should we then search for the origins of Christian racial thought among the Visigoths and their treatment of forced converts from Judaism in the early 7th century? Similarly, in the Muslim debates of the Muhajirun, the sources deployed by both sides had been shaped by centuries of earlier arguments about the reproduction of piety, such as the Shu'ubiyya controversy in Eastern Islam around 800, 900 of the Common Era, which confronted those who defended the primacy of Arab lineages with those who elevated other lineages, such as the Persian, or who argued for the equality of all believers. We know these treatises influenced the development of genealogical thought among Christian converts to Islam in the Iberian Peninsula because we have copies and refutations of them. Should we then assert that racial thought in the Western Mediterranean, Islamic and Christian alike, was forged in the Eastern Islamic Shu'ubiyya? My most recent reading has focused on yet another fracture in Western Islam, namely, this is my last example, I promise, namely the division among the Muslim conquerors of Al-Andalus between Arabs and so-called Berbers. In early and Eastern Islamic texts, the word Berber was relatively neutral, not applied to any particular people. But in the biopolitical vocabulary of Western Islam, it very quickly came to mean specifically the diverse peoples of Northwest Africa, and its valence polarized. In Al-Andalus, Berber became, from the Arab point of view, a negative category, applying to North Africans who, on account of their non-Arabness, should be and were excluded from the highest forms of power. In Ifriqiya, on the other hand, I'm using the term loosely as a parallel with our Africa, meaning all of the Maghreb and the Western Islam, the category was put to work of legitimating new alliances, new relationships to the prophetic tradition, and new forms of power. The energy produced by this polarized field repeatedly overleapt the Straits of Gibraltar, catalyzing new engagements of race and religion. The initial stages of this division are shrouded in obscurity. The Latin Christian Chronicle of 754 provides an early flash of insight in its description of the encounter between Caliph Hisham's army of Syrian Arabs that was sent as reinforcements to repress the North African Muslim rebellion, at the confrontation of that army with the rebellious North African Muslims in 741. And you see here an account, again, a Christian account, but very well informed by Islamic sources of what happened then. And it not only has a distinctive vocabulary for the North Africans, Moor, Maurus in Latin, but also a distinctive color. And in this case, according to this account, the shock of intra-Muslim epidermal differences in early Islamic North Africa was so violent that it horrified even the horses, leading to Arab defeat. Slightly later Arabic sources suggest that the Christian authors of the Chronicle of 754 were very well informed about intra-Muslim tensions. Islamic societies in the West, like those elsewhere in the early Islamic world, were hard at work making sense of the diversity they had so rapidly come to contain. All of the inhabitants of that diverse space, whether Arab or non-Arab, were attempting to relate differences and similarities in color, appearance, language, culture, geography, and many others to the prophetic teachings considered authoritative, with the goal of furthering their own claims to prestige and resisting those of others. That North African Muslims resisted the effort of the Arabs to subordinate them is evident not only in their rebellions, but also in their writings. The earliest example I know of is the Book of Ibn Salam, penned by its North African author early in the 3rd century of Islam. I turned a little early, but you can read this if you like. In the 9th century of the Common Era. Ibn Salam's chapter, quote, on what appeared in the tradition from the Prophet about the virtues of the Berbers, which becomes a genre, Fada'il al-Barbar, provides us with a glimpse of Arab prejudice toward their North African brethren and of Berber strategies to tap Islamic prophecy as a source of power. The chapter gathered hadith, or sayings attributed to the Prophet and his closest followers concerning the Berbers. In its opening story, the Prophet's wife, Aisha, here we have Aisha for the second time, mother of the believers, as the quoted hadith puts it, is seated with 12 of Muhammad's earliest and most loyal followers when a Berber walks into the room. Aisha rises from her pillow and places it before the guest to be seated, and her companions then walk out of the room in anger. After the guest's departure, they justify their ire. Quote, here a Berber showed up among us, a man we all despise because we loathe his group. But you showed preference to him over us and even over yourself. And then Aisha explains her behavior. The messenger of God had once told her of a vision in which the archangel Jibril came to him and said, O Muhammad, I enjoin upon you the fear of God and of the Berbers. The Prophet said, then I asked Jibril, which are the Berbers? He said, that group there, it is they who will revivify the religion of God after it dies and renew it after it has deteriorated. So hadith traditions, as we all know, emerged around many contentious questions in the first centuries of Islam, often on both sides of the issue, and were known to be widely forged. Those offered by Ibn Salam reflect the situation of the society in which they were gathered, sometime around 886 to 87 of the Common Era, 273 of the Hijrah. In them, we can see represented Arab loathing of Berbers as a group and Berber self-presentation as an especially devoted people, one whose courage and piety will save Islam from Arab decay. Now we have to get to genealogy, and that's the slide in front of you. Another tradition reported by Ibn Salam attempts to, because discrimination without reproduction isn't race. I need the reproduction, hence the genealogy. So he attempts to fit the Berbers into the more prestigious genealogies available in the Arab and the Abrahamic world. For knowing the role of the Berbers in Islam, he offers another hadith in which the Caliph Umar, Muhammad's father-in-law, asks for further information about the Berbers. Is there anyone among you who knows this tribe in any of the Arab and non-Arab tribes? No one has an answer, except finally the poet Al-Abbas bin Mirdas al-Sulami raises his hand. They are descendants of Bar, and here's your quote, son of Qais. So this attempt to put them provide them with a genealogy, in this case, an Arab genealogy. Genealogy and etymology here combine in a triple word play on the syllable bar, an explanation of Berber origins indeed worthy of a poet, and one that had the virtue of making the Berbers Arabs and descendants of Isaac's son Ishmael and of Noah's son Shem, which is why Ibn Salam chooses this hadith. But given the emerging biopolitics and bioprophetic importance of the distinction between North Africans and Arabs in Western Islam, it isn't surprising that his pro-Berber genealogy was only one of many on offer. Some early historians, like Ibn Hisham writing in Egypt, describe the Berbers as subjects of the biblical giant Goliath, who fled to the Maghreb after David killed their king, making them descendants of Ham. Said al-Andalusi, writing in 11th century Al-Andalus, approximated the Berbers to the Copts and classified them as Hamite and black, invoking a hadith in which the Prophet declared Arabs, Persians, and Byzantines descendants of Shem, Turks and Slavs, and also Gog and Magog, children of Japheth, with Copts and blacks among Ham's seed. So Said was writing in Al-Andalus at a time when the tension created by these distinctions had exploded into civil war. The Berber contingents and commanders in the Arab Umayyad armies increasingly resented their relegation to more marginal lands, their lack of access to the highest offices in the religious and political hierarchy, and their general subordination to Arabs. The resulting strife brought the Umayyad Caliphate to an end, with Berber rebels repeatedly sacking its capital of Cordoba in 1010-1013. Umayyad power fractured into a welter of competing city-states, with neighboring Christian rulers everywhere expanding their influence. And it's in this context that the two African Berber political confederations, first the Almoravids and then the Almohads that I've already spoken so extensively about, swept the former Arab Umayyad dominions of Al-Andalus into their empires. Then, with the defeat of the Almohads and the rise of the Nasrids in Granada, Iberian Islam would once again become a stronghold of Arabness. And Nasrid texts actually use this very rare word, Arabness, defining itself against the Berber lands across the straits and vice versa. And I could multiply examples. Leo Africanus, one of the most important things he wants to tell Europeans is about this divide between Al-Andalus and Africa. The question I am asking myself now is, how did the Berber-Arab bioprophetic struggle shape the possibilities of racial thought in Iberia and North Africa? Which is also to ask, how did it shape the possibilities of existence for converts from Judaism to Islam and their descendants? And how did it shape the possibilities of existence for the Black Muslims that the Berbers conquered in sub-Saharan Africa in the 16th century and proved so willing to enslave? I want to interconnect all of these histories, but I would not imagine that in doing so, I've discovered in any particular period or place the wellspring of biocultural imaginaries in Christianity or Islam. Every foundation stone we might pick reveals others underneath. The idea that distance or proximity to prophecy and the divine favor is transmitted as the organism reproduces itself through sexual reproductions is always already potential in both Christianity and Islam. The word potential has the advantage of reminding us that the conditions of possibility for the mapping of religion onto reproduction exist in many cultures. And here I'm going to conclude with my conclusion from the Dan David lecture. The potential to imagine that prophecy reproduces itself like an organism is already contained in the language of the promise God makes to Abraham in Genesis. The influence of such passages is evident in the New Testament. It's evident in the Gospel of Matthew's insistence on genealogies, and it's also evident in the Quran. But this does not mean that we should attribute the marriage of race and religion to Genesis. The idea that privilege and stigma are apportioned and reproduced among gods and humans through the selection of seed was already widespread when Genesis was redacted. It's found stamped into the clay of humanity's earliest written records, as here in a Sumerian poem to the fertility god Ninurta from around 2500 BC. In English today, we use different words to distinguish between botanical and animal, male and female gametes. But the Sumerian word numun in the poem means seed of plant, animal, or human, male or female. And this is the case in many ancient languages. In fact, where we encounter words like progeny, lineage, offspring, children, descendants, people, and race in English translations of many ancient texts, including the Hebrew Bible, the Greek New Testament, and the Arabic Quran, the word in the original is often simply seed. Enlil is the chief god of the Sumerian pantheon, and Ninurta is his good seed, by which the poet means that Ninurta, himself the god king of fertility who brings life from seed, is Enlil's chosen offspring. Like the Sumerians themselves, the gods structured the world through the curation of reproduction. The creation of humanity itself could be imagined as the product of this agricultural curation, as in the Song of the Hoe. An ancient Greek quipped that if horses had gods, those gods would look like horses. much of the post-Neolithic humanity has imagined its gods as selectors of seeds because that is what it has itself been, cultivating its own human seed as well as the seed of the field, reflecting on its own reproductive lineages and imagining that its gods did the same. Claims about the sexual reproduction of sameness and difference, privilege and stigma, power and oppression, for good or ill, these biocultural resources fill the reservoir of ideals we call religion, sometimes producing visions of human unity, at other times animating discrimination. Finally, I must insist in orienting my history today around the Abrahamic religions in North Africa and Spain, I don't mean to imply that these faith traditions or these specific regions of Christian and Islamic dominion are especially guilty or especially innocent of intercourse between race and religion. We can find agricultural, reproductive, and biocosmological explanations for the transmission of divine privilege and stigma throughout much of the rest of the world, across space and time, from Hawaii and the Inca Empire to the Shang Emperor of China's earliest historical dynasty around 1600 BC. In fact, we can probably find it everywhere that the Neolithic Revolution took place. A century from now, it may be that histories of race and religion focused on Confucius or Buddha will feel more urgent than those concerned with Abraham, Christ, or Muhammad. That shift of focus would be entirely appropriate. Every present demands its own history. But the shift in focus would not, I think, diminish the importance of the kind of history I'm proposing, a history that attends to the many interconnected ways in which, from the Neolithic to the foreseeable future, ideas about the somatic reproduction of similarity and difference have shaped the possibilities of religious thought and vice versa. Thank you, and I really look forward to your questions. I'll stop sharing as well.
Thank you very, very much. And the floor is open to questions and comments. And I would like to start with the issue of potential. You presented the ways that there was a possibility to think about race as the basis for hierarchy, also in Western Islam, in North Africa. But when I think about Eastern Islam in Central Asia, the potential hasn't been realized because there, from the Mongol invasions onwards, lineage especially from Jinggisid dynasty was a staple for being a member of Islamic elite. In the early modern period in Islamic Asia, you couldn't be part of the elite if you didn't have an alleged or real lineage to the Mongols. So I was wondering whether you can think about the reasons or the ways in which sometimes this potential is realized and not. What is the trigger, or the triggers in the plural?
Wow, so that is, Miri, thank you. The problem, of course, with talking about world history is that you need to know everything, right? I think the Jinggisid and the Mongol example is actually not an exception to the question of potential. It's just the potential taking a different shape. And in fact, I'm not as learned about those topics as you are, not by several orders of magnitude, but I think there are some really interesting genealogical efforts by the Jinggisid and by the Mongols to tie their lineages to other lineages of prestige in the prophetic and in the imperial tradition. And so I don't have it at the front of my mind because I decided to basically keep the later East out of the book, but I collected enormous amounts of such genealogical efforts, even also Ottoman, to try connect their lineages. Even Ibn Khaldun's encounter with Tamerlane is a good example of these kinds of debates over these kinds of efforts. And there is a lot of material, which I think all of it would suggest that what we're seeing is, in fact, the flexibility of the potential, the way in which even people who come from outside, as far as outside as possible in the then known world, are seeking to find ways to integrate their lineages of power and their ethnicities of power, because lineages aren't just about the ruling family, they're actually about a much larger group, and that a fiction of kinship and lineage is unifying to other lineages of prestige. And interestingly, you see the same thing when you integrate not just the old world, but the new world. So you start to see efforts to make claims about North American Indians, or about the Inca and the Maya and the Aztecs, about the Hawaiians, how they integrate into the old prophetic lineages of authority. So I think I see all of that as potential. And if you want an example of how that potential can have really dramatic manifestations, even in the most modern of contexts, I would suggest that we could spend some time looking at the Mormon Church, which is entirely a 19th and 20th century phenomenon, beginning in North America, sorry, but which puts the migration of seed, of prophetic seed, and of the implications of the reproduction of that seed at the very center of its narrative of the entire world's history, and does so in ways that reproduce some basic discriminations. For example, the exclusion of Africans from the priesthood of the Mormon Church until 1978, and also certain treatment of Jews and certain treatment of the 10 Lost Tribes, et cetera, and includes all kinds of peoples into these prophetic narratives, such as North American natives that hadn't been previously included. That's what I mean by potential. And in fact, we're seeing such potential today. In North America right now, there is a movement, a Black African movement, which claims to be the descendant of the Moors, and appropriates some of these Berber genealogies as ways of legitimating its sovereign, they call themselves the sovereign people in North America. So what I'm trying to say is we need to be very flexible about what we recognize as instantiations of this potential. Instantiations won't look the same everywhere. If they did, then this wouldn't be a flexible form of thought. It's like anti-Semitism in that regard. If it looked the same everywhere, it wouldn't have been useful for so long. Just to join it to another one of my old preoccupations. Is that an answer, Mary, or do you feel like I evaded your question?
No, thank you very much. Yes, Naama, please.
Thank you so much. This is very thought-provoking and interesting, and I have many ideas. I'm not sure they will come out very clear, but my first question is, why then racism and not communities? And what's the difference between defining why this category, if it has so much potential of changing? And if you can explain, is it a political question, or do you think this relates to biology essentially? This is one line of kind of understanding the categories that you place here and the importance of using them in circumstances that are more fluid. You mentioned the Black Africans and the Moors. It seems to me that the genealogy is not biological, but more imaginative, and maybe a different word, such as belonging, would be more sensible. And I think in some ways, well, I'm not saying it's more sensible. I'm trying to figure out how is this defined. And another question that was raised, that you raised, the story of the blood, God's punishment of the Jews, and the issue of courage as changing the essence of the Jews, right? The melancholic Jews, right? You referred to this in the beginning. There is a question of race in the sense of an ethnic character, but there's also a sense of culture and something that is changeable. And there's in the history of Spanish understanding, right? There's this move from from a question of faith to race, but this, I think, it's worth thinking about how medicine, and especially medieval medicine, relates to this change with Aristotelian thought about the import or Galenic thought about the importance of characteristics and emotions as changing the bodies themselves as a more shifting category. And I'm not sure I'm clear enough in what I'm saying, but just going back to just an idea of race is more clear-cut than I think these, especially 14th century ideas are more permeated by ideas about characteristics. So I was wondering if you can respond to that. And maybe I'll leave it there. You know, my mind is still wrapping around all the examples and ideas that you put for us.
Yeah, and I'm sorry I put so many examples out there, but I kind of feel that every now and then I have to convince people I really am a historian and not something else. Thank you for these questions. I think I'll try answer maybe the first two. So why racism and not community? What's at stake in this? And it's very related to your statement that you think these things are not biological but imaginative. And you asked, is it political? So I guess one of the issue we really face with race and racism, I mean, one of the issues we face is that on the one hand, it's clearly a very powerful logic about the reproduction of sameness and difference amongst humans. And on the other hand, we are all aware that almost every manifestation of that logic, every attempt to claim that sameness or difference are reproduced the way the organism reproduces itself organically is imaginative, is cultural, is constructed. That's the basic insight of critical race theory too, but it's to the degree that we just insist it's all imaginative. In fact, I think I tried to set this aside at the beginning by saying, by putting Bartlett and myself in opposite corners and saying it's not enough to say that something is imaginative in order to say that it's not racial. So then, because all race is imaginative, none of the things race is except, sickle cell anemia or a few very, very technical things that race is invoked to account for, does it actually account for? So then, why is it so powerful? Why is it so powerful in modernity? And why have reproductive explanations for the persistence of difference and similarity, privilege and stigma, power and powerlessness existed in many other societies too, which we can think about the relationship to our modern ones. And one of the things I'm trying to argue, this isn't purely political, is that the reason those kinds of, I'll call them fantasies, but these systems of thought are so powerful is because they invoke and seem to be justified by, claim to be justified by common sense knowledge about the natural world. And I can show you in earlier chapters how this common sense knowledge is at the very heart of Sumerian thinking about reproduction, Greek thinking about, you mentioned Galenic thinking, Aristotelian thinking, airs, waters, places, all kinds of authoritative texts, and how those forms of thinking about the natural world that are applied to thinking about the reproduction of sameness and difference amongst humans. So if we just say imaginative, if we just say community, if we just say kin, if we just say whatever evasion we want, we are missing the main problem, the main power, the main animating force behind these forms of discrimination. And that doesn't help us. That only hurts us. It doesn't help us to say, no, these things have no power. Of course they have power. If they didn't have power, they wouldn't have convinced so many people for so long. I don't believe we gain anything by that. So I think we need to always insist on the imagined or the cultural quality of whatever racism claims is biologically produced, but we should never underestimate the effectiveness of agricultural logics because they have been so powerful in helping us control our world. They work. And I think you're actually seeing this today also as well in the rise of a new human genetics and its application to history. That there are moments in which biology and certainly the new genetics is we're in one of these moments, seems to acquire sudden explanatory value so great that its marginalization as irrelevant to thinking about culture is overcome for a bit, and sometimes for good, sometimes for ill. So it's too early to tell whether David Reich's lab at Harvard and the Max Planck Institute on Human Genetics, on the genetics of human history is a good thing or a bad thing. So that's one half of the thing. And I think I would say the same about your point about the blood punishment of Jews has an element of race, but it's also cultural because it's changeable. That's another thing. I mean, I think critical race theory, but really we didn't need critical race theory to tell us this. The idea that race is about the immutable, this is just simply not true. It's never been true. Racial logics have always been about the fact or the belief that mixing will produce change. It will either weaken the elite or it will strengthen the subordinate, but it will produce change. So I think many of the basic, the shorthands we have for thinking this is what race looks like. Race is about immutability and it's got to be modern and it's this and that. Those shorthands aren't helping us really understand how race works in our own period, let alone in the ancient world. And many scholars of colonialism, for example, so now colonial race, which we all agree is race, have stressed that racial discourses are about anxieties of changeability in the metropole. They're not about, I mean, immutability is always just an argument that is related to an anxiety about mutability. Same argument's been made about casta paintings in Mexico, et cetera. So I would just say that what I'm really trying to show how all of these things coexist in societies at once. Many different explanations for difference and stigma and privilege exist at once. And they're always being, sometimes they're in competition with each other, just like the many seed theories about how we reproduce were in competition with each other. And we don't gain much by trying to say, trying to erect taboo areas around, say, thinking about reproduction. That's my kind of methodological commitment. And I know that it's highly debatable. That's kind of why I'm proposing it, right? If it were consensus, I wouldn't feel. I won't go to the emotions and changing bodies because I think, although it's really interesting, and I have I've been working a lot on what we call the multiple seed theories, the interaction between seed theory, meteorology, and astrology. There's so many different forms of determinism and determination and freedom in all of these systems. And what we really want is to be able to, in some sense, see how they all interact and change each other in certain moments, and then ask why those moments and why those places.
Thank you very much. And Oded, you raised your digital hand.
Thank you. Thank you for this very stimulating talk. It's great to hear this after the previous David talk, because now it gives, I feel like I have a much more concrete picture of many of the things you're trying to get at. And I'm wondering whether in the spirit of offering something for discussion, I was thinking in listening to your talk about an old article by Michael Baxendale, the art historian, who has an article about art and society, must we choose? And the answer is ultimately yes, because art and society are very complex constructs, and they are interconnected and interpenetrating to an extent. But if you think about art, you can think about society as a whole. If you think about society as a whole, you have to limit art. You always have to reduce one in order to make it fit the other. And I was wondering whether to an extent certain of the comments you've been getting, so I was also thinking about Naama's point about community, relate to the fact that at some points you have two very big constructs here. One, the analytical, which I think is absolutely essential, biocultural discrimination, and the other is race. And whether in some situations one has to be reduced in order to fit the other. And they can't be handled as complete wholes. And I'll try to give two concrete examples to what I mean about it. If you think about European nobilities in the early modern period, and we start to compare them, we have, when we look at the French nobility, it has very strong components that are based on race and lineage, just like in ras or rathe, but also about service components. If you look at the Russian nobility post Peter the Great, it's much more about service. The race element is really not as emphasized. And if you look at the English gentry, nobody knows what it's really about, but it's very close and it's hard to get into it. So if you try to look at European nobilities, you get race only in parts of them. And it's much easier to compare the French and the Spanish ones, but it doesn't work as well when comparing them to the Russian and the English gentry. So if you're looking at the nobility as part of a bioculture, as a form of biocultural discrimination, you can look at it as a whole, but then you have to limit the meaning of race. Whether if you really want to talk about race in depth, you compare the French and the Spanish ones and maybe a little bit about the gentry, but then you don't talk about biocultural discrimination as a whole. And I was wondering, and perhaps this could also work for medieval and early modern Islam in the sense that, of course, you can look at the Shurafas, but I was imagining, and Miri and Ben Yarbel can speak to this much more knowingly and eloquently. In that context, they would surely compare it both to Sufi tariqas and to Mamluks, who are also a form of artificial kinship, but it's really not about the seeds. So if you compare the genealogy there and look at it as a form of biocultural discrimination, you don't get race to the same extent. If you want to look at the racial elements, you have to lose parts of the lineages as part of the biocultural discrimination. And does it simply mean that you have to, I don't think you have to choose, but maybe delimiting where those contract areas are can help in articulating why community is relevant in certain places and not in others. It's kind of like thinking about those as two big things which may be delineated more clearly in different contexts, and thinking about different delineations in different chapters would actually help to show how the story unfolds.
Yeah, yes, I love this suggestion. And in fact, it reminds me of one example I spend some time, maybe too much time on in thinking about, has to do with, I keep on stressing similarity and difference, and the reproduction of similarity and difference. And I do think that from the point of view of the historian, what similarities and differences we find significant are what drives all of our work, and it's the most important question before us as historians. And I think in a way you're saying that, what are the similarities and differences in this case between biocultural discriminations and race? What's the tension between them, but also between many particular examples across space and time. They're not, of course, who would argue that they're all the same or that the same concept could apply to them? So what I'm trying to do in the book is stress that when we're thinking about the history of concepts, and biocultural discrimination is one of the ways I'm trying to evolve to show that race isn't any one thing. We always have to ask, well, what similarity, what difference am I perceiving? And of course, there are others I'm not perceiving, and that drives that will drive what we determine to be significant. I begin early in the book with an example of Plato's critique of art, and so here you know, Baxendale is really perfect because he's very angry at the artists for being able to make things that look similar to something but are not that something, and this has vast epistemological implications that he brings out by saying a wolf is very similar to a dog, but erring between the two of them is very dangerous. Right? So of course, in all of these, in every chapter, in every argument, the question is always, what are the similarities and the differences? Like, none are reduced. No thing, no concept, no example is reducible to another. That's already implicit and explicit in any effort at comparison. So I take your point, and I think that trying to find a way to make explicit that this is the problem of the historian is good, and that I should make sure that I'm always returning to that, and with every example returning to its limitations, so as not to give the sense that clearly many of you have, because Nama's question was also very similar, that I'm trying to reduce one thing to another. But I think that we can always decide what danger, what error is more pressing and more likely in a given moment of our own practice. For a long time, I think, and I did this also in anti-Judaism, my sense was that the error that we're more, let's just say the intellectual vice, the intellectual habit that we're more inclined toward, to use Galenic language, is cutting, is separating things and saying, no, this doesn't have anything to do with that. And that in so doing, we often miss the power over time of certain discursive formations, because either we've cut them too fine, and as Montaigne says, cut anything small enough and everything loses its meaning, or because we've cut them too large, or we've learned the dangers of cutting them too large. What I'm trying to develop is a practice that allows us to see why there are discursive habits that do change shape over time, but persist, and also account for these differences that you're really stressing. So I like this suggestion very much, that I should really emphasize that biocultural discrimination is not the same as race, that biologics are, but that I'm interested also in always exploring how these things become one another, or are analogized with one another. What are the analogies, which is the most a historian can do.
Thank you very much. And Sonia, thank you for joining us from Berlin. Now it's your turn, please.
Thank you very much, Miri. Thank you very much, David. And contrary to my usual preference when asking a question, I'm unable to be brief. No,
right,
it's really
I'm
extreme.
unable to be brief in anything. So.
It's very, very difficult because I have to say emotionally, I feel very uneasy with how you introduced your topic. And that somehow seems to resonate with my predecessor's questions and makes it for me difficult to be brief, right? Because I even, with the predecessor, have to say, I'm not certain I can really respond to what you were doing at the beginning. I feel much more at ease with the historical examples, yeah, because they seem to be more familiar. Of course, everything is culturally constructed because we are doing it. it's going through human beings. But of course, this is a modern theory, let's say the last 40 years that we take more or less. Not everybody of my colleagues even shares that today, but more or less we agree all that everything we construct in science or whatever part of our enterprise is culturally constructed. So what does it help us to say that a certain biological theory is culturally constructed? I need more, yeah? I also side with Miri with the suspicion that genealogy per se is not the same as racism. It's not the same potentiality because, of course, the Timurids that Miri invoked have a very complicated and ever-changing genealogy. But that's not, in my understanding, which is limited, about biological reproduction. Most genealogy, my impression is, whether it's the Habsburgs or the Arabs, is a historical invention. Yeah, so I was very surprised last year when I was forced to read Ibn al-Nadim about Arabic, Persian, and Syriac language and genealogy to learn from people who do this kind of research that this is all an invention. Arabs is a complicated thing. And so the Arabs versus the Ajamis is apparently, I don't know really, an Umayyad invention. And most of what's written in the genealogies is not true by no means of standard, right? So I'm confused, I really admit that. Yeah? And in a sense, I would really feel more at ease, perhaps, if you indeed worked out more clearly for me to understand, and that's of course a subjective question, what is it that motivates you to collapse a term like racism with race, and both with biological reproduction, and all three things with human discrimination, yeah? So I think it's fine to write about these topics, but is it all right to, yeah, I don't know, identify them in the manner as you do? So I think that's my basic trouble, yeah? So I'm not at all criticizing that you want to write about discrimination, about specific forms of discrimination. I find that very valuable and important. But are all the things you presented, all your examples, do they belong in this category? And that I cannot understand if I have not more understanding for your basic terms. Yeah? So I'm really sorry. I feel I should not have opened my mouth because I said too much. Okay, thank you. Oh, wait, one more thing. You said something about common sense, and then later in an answer about discourse. So what I thought was maybe it would be helpful to some degree if you read a bit more than you may have done about discourse theories and critical discourse analysis and common sense, because common sense, as they understand it, is, in between quotation marks, the naturalization of ideology. So we consider as common sense in this kind of sociological linguistics, or linguistic sociology, as you like, all things that have sedimented by human power, social activity, social action, cultural construction, whatever you want, onto a level that we cannot see it's critical anymore. Yeah, and then it's common sense. And so I have a problem then here too. Yeah, in which sense do you use common sense? I thought, I felt, perhaps I didn't think, I felt that there seems to be a too much generalizing tendency in what you seem to propose. So again, I apologize. I rarely do these things.
Oh, I've heard you do this many times, Sonia. I don't think you rarely do these things. I think it's very much your intellectual style, and I'm very grateful for it. I think parts of these are just, I don't know, failures of communication, misunderstandings. So for example, your first point about everything is culturally constructed, how does this help us? I need more, was my point too. That it doesn't help to say that, and that in fact, I'm trying to provide them more. The second point, genealogy is not the same as racism. It's a historical invention, etc. I need more. I mean, the interesting thing about genealogy, which is of course not the same as racism. Of course it isn't. And in every example I gave, I tried to map it onto actual discriminations, actual deployments of genealogy into arguments about reproduction. I didn't give just general arguments about genealogy. But what's interesting about genealogy is that at every point that it, I shouldn't say at every point, but at some really interesting points, you can see both the awareness that it's an invention, as even Mayara said, and simultaneously its deployment as a non-invention, as an explanation for how somatic reproduction of features we might call cultural takes place, virtues and vices takes place. And so I'll give you an example of one thinker who says both things at the same time. I know you know Plato's Republic, in which Plato's discussing with Glaucon about how human society should be reproduced in order to produce people of virtue and separate people of virtue from people of vice so as to maximize virtue and vice. And the example Socrates gives Glaucon is how Glaucon breeds his hawks, his dogs, and his horses. And he says, you know, obviously you breed only the best with the best. Otherwise, what would happen? You would get a decline in the quality. And by breeding the best and best, you get an increase in the quality. And that's what we need to do with people. So you might argue, and there's a suggestion that Glaucon keeps lists of this as he does it, pedigrees. Genealogies, pedigrees, they're actually closely related things ever since the Persian Achaemenid Empire. So you might say, well, Plato is buying into the same idea that the French in the 16th century say that you should, if you just what you do with your dogs of chasse, and you should do with the race of Frenchmen if you want to improve the quality of the population of France. At the same time, Socrates in the Theaetetus says, well, everybody knows that only fools believe genealogy. They're inventions by people to achieve things. Both of these ideas can be present, and both of us, in any moment we study as a historian, will see them both present. We'll both see an awareness. The Inquisition is a great example, an awareness of the malleability of genealogy, of its ficticity, and also of its power, and of the ways in which its power is produced because it marshals knowledge about reproduction. I don't know what to say about your comment about being more self-conscious about what motivates my desire to bring these concepts together. I think I'm pretty self-conscious about it. And I also don't know really what to say about your reaction to my use of the word common sense. The truth is, there is, of course, common sense means, here's why I use the word common sense there, two reasons. One is that in some of the anthropology of science work on the Neolithic revolution, on the agricultural revolution, it's worked very hard to use that phrase to describe common sense and natural philosophy as emerging from these practices that are not elite practices, although they have, of course, also elite theorists, but are very much practices of agriculturalists. And the other reason I used it is because very often in the debate about the difference between Darwinian and post-Darwinian biological racism and why there can't be pre-Darwinian biological racism, the argument is used that you don't have Darwin, so you can't have biological racism. And I think in some of the work against that has used the phrase common sense, agricultural knowledge, to show both how Darwin drew from many agricultural manuals for practitioners in the development of his own work, so as to diminish the meaningfulness of that particular claim about without this kind of biology, you can't have race. So I hope that answers some of your concerns. I don't think any of it will answer your general concern about the fact that I generalize too much. It's true. There's no way to write histories that seek to, I don't know what the right word is, alert us to the possibility that we have habits of thought that are powerful, and that are powerful precisely because they've proven useful in basic and fundamental ways and have often become non-critical. Not always, they can be critical and non-critical simultaneously in different parts of society, even in different parts of the same person, same mind. I don't see how you write such histories without being quite general. And I hope you never have occasion to read the recent history of number that I published, because I know I could imagine that it's susceptible to many of the same critiques. Or if you do read it, I hope you do critique it so I can learn from that. But I don't know if that's a response adequate to your point, but you should never, of course. So yeah, why would you ever apologize for making your inimitable intellectual contribution to too general a project?
Thank you, David. Just a quick answer, because I'm not certain, you see, because I react out of emotional impressions and not with a long list of books having read in preparation of your talk, right? So I react as my feelings that emerge when you talk, yeah? And so I wanted to transport that, but it's very unusual that you do this in an academic debate.
But you know, your feelings are very helpful to me, and because they are I think your reaction is it tells me that there is something in the way I present this material to you, and it's not just your reaction. I mean, you are quite right that I see similarities, also differences, in your reaction and Nama's and Oded's and Miri's, but that there's something in the way in which I present this material, no matter how many specific historical examples I offer, that really stands in the way, blocks the hearer, the reader, the interlocutor from feeling the specificity of the engagement. And that's a problem. That's telling me that there's something in the structure of the book, in the structure of my presentation, in the structure of my thinking that you know, that arouses those emotions. So I'm grateful, you know, that you would share them with me.
Nama, I wanted to add.
Did you ask me something? No.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's such an interesting discussion about there is obviously an interest and need for great histories, but then when you bring them out, it always raises the question of: is it too big? Is it too undiscriminating in how it views the different histories? And I think that thinking about this emotional reaction is a very good opening question for why we do such. What is the urge to do these things, these kind of histories, and what is the point of where it comes from? And I'm sorry that I'm taking the floor again, but I'm really curious about if you can say more about who are you speaking to in this history? I think it's a very important project, and it's bound to raise questions from historians of different fields in why are you linking things together? But it seems to me you're not only speaking, your motivation is very strong for not historians, it's really speaking out there for a broader community. And that shifts how it's an emotional shift. So I'm just responding to this. Sonia is saying she's responding from her heart, I think, or from her emotions. I think this is also a very emotional history for you as a historian. And I don't know, maybe I'm taking the floor, and I'm sorry, but I think if you, I'm curious about how you see that as an emotional project.
Yeah, I mean, there must be something highly personal about the shape of one's engagement with the world. And I felt that most strongly with the shift from communities of violence, which was a very archive-based and local argument, to anti-Judaism, which was very much driven by a profound feeling about the state of the world, right? a shift in my feeling about the state of the world, an internal shift. And I feel like I have a narrative about how that happened, although it's not in the book. So in that case, I can say, well, here's why I felt that one form of engagement with the past is inadequate to the needs of the present. A form of engagement that I had thought was perfectly adequate, in fact, necessary 15 years before, right? So I do think you're right that there are very subjective drives. And I do think we're at a moment in which history is being deployed as a weapon, particularly around issues of identity. And race is one of the powerful, it's the shorthand for all of that. Which is a very dangerous moment for all of us, and as historians, and as people of goodwill, and as citizens in the world. And I'm trying to engage that in my own way, which is usually, again, it's now a big way. But I will say that there's also professional, so there's the soul, right? There's one's individual psyche that shapes things. There are also professional structures and habits, and I'll even say, I'm not sure what, I was looking for a more negative word. And I think historians, we have fallen into, professional historians, historians who are writing for each other, for the guild, have fallen into a form of specialization that gives us a spurious sense of control over our material. Because actually, no matter how deep you go, you've never exhausted, no matter how narrowly you cut the question and how deep you go into it, you've never exhausted the sources available to it or the things that could be asked of it. And so that's why I say it's a spurious sense of control. And that we have made that as our measure of what historians should do. My teacher, John Boswell, when I was an undergraduate, he wrote large books about gay marriage, about social tolerance and homosexuality, about things like this, from the ancient world to the present. And he used to complain about what he called the Perugian wax theory that dominated the historical profession, according to him. And that was that you write your dissertation about Perugian wax seals between 1342 and 1346, and then your second book about Perugian wax seals between 1346 and 1348. And I think if you look at the rest of the world on a question like race, I gave an early version of this kind of, was there race before modernity, to a group of early modernists at the University of Chicago, and not historians. And none of them could understand why I thought it was a big deal to assert that there was race before modernity. They assumed, and these are very educated people who work in literature and in art and other fields, that many of these things have a long history. They haven't committed, even though they are critical thinkers, to the particular historian's view that you cut things ever finer in order, that's the role of critical thought. And that in particular, when it comes to something like race, that it has a prehistory, that it can usefully be thought across time. So our assumptions, the assumptions that dominate all of us in this room, are not the same as those even of other very educated people in disciplines in the humanities. Quite the contrary. Now, does that mean we should abandon ours? No, it just means that to learn humility, you have to leave home. And in some ways, I'm trying to leave home on this subject.
Thank you very much. I think we started the discussion, this seminar talking about race, and now we are talking about our very own craft, which is very, very interesting. Tammy, please.
Thank you. So thank you for another inspiring lecture and for this very stimulating discussion, which gives us much to think about, both in terms of academic styles, including ones that are sometimes employed in our own institution as a result of the formazione, the intellectual formation of some of our colleagues, but not others. And but also regarding what motivates us as historians and why we're doing what we're doing. And I have to say that I did think about, I mean, in your case, Communities of Violence was so successful and opened up this whole new field of religious relations and contacts in Iberia, and then you moved on to much larger longue durée projects and global. And don't you miss archival work?
Well, two things to that. One is I haven't really stopped doing archival work. I've only stopped really writing about it. So Neighboring Phase had a lot of results of archival work in it that's all post Communities of Violence. And I continue to empty the archives of the Crown of Aragon. I have now every document mentioning a Muslim or a Jew from the archive of the Crown of Aragon from 1225 till 1460 something. So, and have I used it? No, but I continue to empty it. Now, though, I'm also, I'm very happy to be working on Arabic sources. So it really, and to bring North Africa into conversation with Iberia in a way that I don't think has been done. Tell me that anyone has really put limpieza de sangre and Maghrebi ideas about religious identity, lineage, etc., into play with each other, and I'd be interested in knowing, but I don't know that work. So in that sense, I don't think that it's not. I think we can do both if we want to. Now, obviously, one loses a lot. One of the things one loses is, in some ways, an audience. How can I put this? You asked, who am I writing for? And the truth is, I don't know. Right? Every time I had this problem with anti-Judaism too. I knew I didn't have a natural audience. That's why I didn't talk to anyone about the book. I never gave a paper from the book, because who would want to hear about I don't know, what medievalists would want to hear about Kant or about the Egyptians, right? So I find this is a real problem. I think it is a real problem. I don't know how to solve it except to tack back and forth between genres. Does that work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it works wonderfully for you. We are, dealing with this kind of conflict because we're under constant pressure in Israeli universities, as you know, as public universities, to conform to the scientific standards of what they call academic production. So you have to really speak to the guild, to the international guild, in order to get funded by your university. Whereas in Israel, until not that many years ago, it was okay to be a public intellectual and not publish in high impact factor journals and not get any grants, and you could still be a very highly admired historian. And today, if people do this, the Faculty of Humanities gets censored and even penalized for this person not producing the kind of guild-focused academic product, as they call it, or scientific products. So I guess as a university administrator, high up in the administration, you also had to deal with this sort of tension. But I assume it's different in American universities, where being a public intellectual is also considered an asset, which is something that doesn't happen in Israel formally.
Well, this is very sad. I mean, what you're saying is very true and very sad. It reminds me of Georg Simmel's idea of the tragedy of culture. That beginning already in his period, the late 19th century, scientific research had ceased to be a space in which one could actualize one's own desires, interests that were vital to oneself, and had become so specialized and so guild-oriented that it couldn't be a site for actual self-actualization. So that's the tragedy. And it's interesting that in that sense, there seems to be ever more of a Euro-American divergence, because the whole notion of publishing in high-impact journals, which came from the sciences, and applying it to the humanities, devaluing the book, which usually has much more impact than any high-impact journal if the book is successful, et cetera, is something that you see in Europe, but not in North America. And the strange thing is that I do a lot of these Exzellenzinitiative evaluations in Germany, et cetera, and they always say, well, this is the Americanization of the European Academy, but that actually never happened in America. The humanities haven't become scientized and metricized, as it's really about metrics, the way they have in Spain, France, and Italy and Germany, and I guess England too. So that's,
and now also in Israel, we have actually our rector insists that a book is worth 5 articles, 5 journal articles. So,
but because a book usually has all kinds of multipliers around it, reviews, digests, multiple readers who engage with it. A successful book often has much more impact than scholarly journal articles, and this is not something that's understood by people who come from the science world of where there's no such thing as books. So what you say is very true, and that's what I meant when I said there's also professional structures that. It also is very dangerous for truly interdisciplinary work, and often we call interdisciplinary stepping into paths that already exist. I don't know, but very seldom do we do work that is so interdisciplinary that it doesn't already have a journal that exists for it, right? And but if you do that kind of work, you can't get it published. This is a problem in the sciences. It's also a problem in the humanities. And I don't know what the answer is. I think you're right that it's a privilege to be able to write whatever the fuck you want. And I know I'm privileged in that sense, but I want to stress that I felt really bad about it for a long time. So if I could just be autobiographical, there was a long time between communities of violence and anti-Judaism. And anti-Judaism was not the kind of book my peers in history departments would really like. And so I think I do feel I spent a lot of time anxious about taking that risk. And I'm not sure the risk paid off. The reader's report, I received reader's reports for the book on race and religion, not just for the proposal, not the book is not close to done, but the proposal. And the reader's report was one of the reader's reports was very, very positive about this book. And he said, and his community, or she or he said, they said, the Communities of Violence was a very successful book amongst historians. Anti-Judaism, maybe not so much because it was too complicated. And but this will be, right? So, you see these moments in which you are confronted with your failures as in these efforts to try make your voice both conform to, but also be original within the space of thought of our age, of our zeitgeist. I don't know, it's really hard. I think all of us face the same challenge, how to speak what we want to speak in ways that we can be permitted to speak it. That is, in ways that the structure will recognize and reward, and thereby create the conditions of possibility for our speaking. I don't know the answer. I would say if you have tenure, you should have courage.
That is, it's also very true, because basically we become researchers in the humanities because basically we care about humanity and we care about the present and future of humanities. But then as a historian, you do find yourself dealing with this tension about, am I more qualified than other people to talk about the present just because I've spent so much time studying a very specific segment of the past? So your insights were very, very encouraging, actually, for those of us who are dealing with these kind of thoughts.
And also there are students here with us, and I think it's a very strong message for them to hear and think about possible models as they move ahead and join our ranks. So they know the challenges, but they also understand why it is so important, and they get this inner motivation to carry the torch further.
Yeah, I mean, if I could, Miri, I don't know if I just want to, your point is very important and moving. And I think it reminds us that I do think there's a demoralization of many young people in the field in the humanities, but also in the field of history. And one of the reasons for that demoralization is this feeling that the specialization that they are being disciplined into doesn't speak directly to the needs of the present. I hear, I was in charge of the graduate school at the University of Chicago for some time, and this was a really important source of depression. And one of the reasons why they feel that is that tragedy of culture I was just referring to, that the way in which we define what we do very often comes at the cost of being able to try to explicitly imagine what that might offer the present, what the similarities and differences with the present are, and differences with the present are. And so more and more people go only into contemporary history, because there they feel they can directly affect or directly speak to their conditions of being. And I think this is a terrible mistake, but we have brought it upon ourselves precisely by insisting on erecting too many hedges around, I was going to say the Torah, but the present as historians, or around our own specialty or our own moment in time, our own the culture we choose to study.
I think this is a wonderful note to end our wonderful seminar. Please, everyone, join me in thanking David for this.
Beautiful.
Yeah. We want really to thank you. It was a masterpiece, really, a masterclass. So thank you. Yeah. So thank you, everyone, for joining us with David today. Stay safe. Make sure that you keep yourself healthy. So good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Bye.